said earlier, in his image and likeness, that no matter what, I'm not deserting you. I'm not forsaking you. I'm not going to leave you to wallow in your own kind of pain and suffering that way. You see, my thought, and I want to go back, we've read this several times, and it may not be going around in your minds right now, that's okay. But let's read it again. I don't know whose version to trust now. You guys got all kinds of strange things. I'm going to go with yours. I'm going to go with yours, Mary.
I believe this is the New King. Oh no, this is American Standard.
It'll be good, I'm sure. Go to John 8. Do you remember when we were talking about the cross early on? The places where Jesus talked about being lifted up. Well, John 8 is one of them. When you get to John 8, hopefully these verses will be familiar because we read them several times. Verses 28 and 29.
So Jesus said, "When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am He, and I do nothing on my own initiative, but I speak these things as the Father taught me. And He who sent me is with me."
Where is he?
He's with me.
Oh.
He's not left me alone.
What?
He's not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to Him.
Now we got some serious
Now,
problems.
that's an issue, but
Yeah, we got some serious problems now. Because over here Jesus is saying, you'll see that the Father is with me. And now over here, Father, why have you forsaken me? Where's he gone? You can't have both. You're going to have to make up your mind who Jesus was toying with when. Or you're going to have to die to something that perhaps you've thought and believed and gravitate towards Psalm 22. It starts off with that statement, and I am sure that every one of us in this room has at least felt like that at one time or another. Like God, for some reason, had moved so far out of town, he was gone. And that's the way we felt. And it's described why in the psalm. And then in the middle of it, it says, "You have answered me," which is where the temporary kind of thing comes in, where people say, well, he temporarily deserted him. It wasn't permanent. That particular statement, "You have answered me." Again, I go back to the Hebrew because it's very helpful. "You have answered me," in the middle of Psalm 22. Jacob, follow me back to Jacob. Do you remember when Jacob had the ladders there and the angels are ascending and descending and the whole thing? That's in Genesis 28. In Genesis 35, Jacob refers back to that moment in Genesis 28, Jacob's ladder. He refers back to it, and he's telling his family and the people around him, God answered me. He refers back to that as God answering him, but he wasn't crying out to God. His life was a wreck. He was trying to figure out how to get what he wanted out of life and how to serve God. The guy was a wreck, and he has a dream. And in the dream, he sees this whole thing happening. And the way he phrases it, in 30 years later, was God answered him. Now, we said earlier when we were talking about prayer that God answers prayer before we even ask it. But do you remember what Jacob says in Genesis 28? I'm sure you will once I say it. He says, "How awesome is this place?" And he said, God was here, and I didn't know it. In other words, Jacob didn't realize that God was there all the time. In the middle of Psalm 22, when it says, "You have answered me," the picture is a wonderful picture of Jacob when God was there right in his face, and he didn't know it. How awesome is this place? God's right here, and I didn't know it. I didn't know it. But he was right there, but I didn't know it. Psalm 22. By the time you finish the psalm, like I said, it makes it clear God was there all the time. But it felt to David, to Jesus. I think the thing that we forget is, like we were saying earlier, we have got Jesus so deified that we often forget that he was human. And when we read things like Hebrews 4, how he was touched in the same way we are. He experienced a variety of things, so his humanity, our humanity, you could never say to Jesus, you don't understand. I mean, you could, but that wouldn't be true, because as a human being, he experienced everything that we experience. You see, what I think, I believe Jesus, that when he said on the cross, my Father will be there with me. He will not leave me nor forsake me. And then you see Jesus crying out. Well, then why are you crying out? Because he's pointing to Psalm 22 that even in his day they didn't get. They didn't hear him quoting Psalm 22. They thought he was calling for help from Elijah. Jesus feels our humanity, our weaknesses. And I believe, personally, because we have been talking about the cross, I feel like that moment on the cross, he's saying to us, I know that you have days, weeks, months, hopefully not years, where you really feel like you're going through hell. I want you to know, you may be, but I'm with you. I'm with you. I know you don't feel like it. And I know even like Jacob, you don't even see it. But I'm always there with you, always. And that moment on the cross, when Jesus cries that out, he might as well have cried out, Psalm 22, Psalm 22, Psalm 22. Read it, read it, read it. I'm telling you, right now, I feel like I'm in the darkest place I've ever been in my whole life. But I know my Father will not leave me nor forsake me. I mean, if you want to run down the sin route, which we can, then that's has even other kind of comforts to it. That says that, no matter where we are and what we've done, God's not against us. He doesn't hate us. He hasn't thrown in the towel on us. And he certainly hasn't left us, because he can handle it. If nothing else, we get out of the cross and his Son, he can deal with it. He's got bigger shoulders than we do, no matter how heavy the crossbeam is. You see, the whole thing was for our sake. The kinds of things I hear Jesus saying from the cross is, know you're forgiven. Know you're forgiven. Say, yeah, but God, I killed an innocent man. I know. You're forgiven. Today you will be with me. You will be with me. He makes these promises, these things from the cross, for our sake. And I think this one is, I know you feel deserted at times, but you're not. I've got a lot more scriptures here, which we won't read, that all verify that God does see, that God does look. He does not turn his back or his face or his eyes or anything else. He does not do that. What he does do is when he sees, he gets no pleasure or delight out of it, which is at the essence of all the different scriptures, which again is a bit unlike us. A lot of times we see things happen to people and we say, they had it coming. They got what they deserved. And God's saying, well, that's not one of my qualities. I get no joy. I get no pleasure out of seeing the unrighteous suffer. Like I said before, did Jesus never look at the people he ministered to? Because they were all sinners. They were all packed with it. Every single one of them. The disciples that he called. I mean, it gets crazy after a while. Or maybe Jesus is not God. Maybe we got that part wrong. Well, there's some real heresy for you. maybe he just spoke at them and never looked at them, or he closed his eyes. I mean, where do we want to go with this nonsense? The last thing I put down here is, because I've heard this too. A lot of the stuff I've heard, I've been in conversations with people. It's not like, it's just stuff over the years. If you talk to enough people, you'll hear it all, I suppose, you know. And one of the last things here is, well, you know, I get that he never takes his eyes off of us. So when we're in sin, you're right, you know, he still looks at us. But he sees his son when he looks at us. So that's what he's really looking at. Even though we're in sin, he sees his son. Well, then what the heck did he see on the cross? What is that about then? There's a lot of different questions to be answered that almost become nonsensical after a while, instead of just receiving the fact, listen, sometimes we get ourselves into a mess, and sometimes people get us into a mess. All of us in this room have been around long enough to know what the word suffering means. Sometimes we've created our own, sometimes somebody else has created it for us. And the depths of our hearts and emotions can be very deceiving. I think Jeremiah said something like that. Our hearts can be very deceiving. And we can actually think and believe, even though God has promised us He'd never leave us nor forsake us, we can actually feel like, yeah, but this time I've gone too far or something, you know. And I almost hear Jesus from the cross saying, I said never. I said never. But I also know how you feel. Don't ever think that I don't feel like that. So it gets kind of funny after a while when we see this moment on the cross of humanity, Jesus' humanity and his divinity. And one of the most outrageous things, this is the way I see it anyway, is in the midst of that intense suffering, he quotes Psalm 22 for us. That he's thinking about us in the midst of his suffering. That takes me to a different place in Jesus. That makes me want to know him and love him even more. Because I'll tell you what, in my darkest moments, I'm generally not thinking about anybody else. I'm thinking about how the heck to get out of this. You know? And he's saying, I'm thinking about how to help you guys out of it. Because you're going to feel like you're up here sometimes. And lastly, there's a beautiful expression that is used for God's people, which is everybody, being the apple of his eye, which refers to the pupil. In other words, God can't help but look at us. We are the apple of his eye. We're the pupil. Whatever condition the pupil's in, it is. But it's still the apple of his eye. You can probably tell I take issue with the fact that God turns his back or closes his eyes or does whatever people say he does in our deepest hours of need. I find it funny that we would argue about certain kinds of doctrine and predestination and we would find so many things to argue about and so readily accept something that's so awful. All of us in here being parents, what would it take for us to desert our kids? To block our ears and our eyes from their needs and their cries? We might momentarily. I'm so freaking mad. But then God deals with us.
Yes, he can.
He says, that's not me, that's not you. And this is tough. This is tough. But I'm with you.